This is our last lecture, Foreign and Military Policy for Unit 5. Um, let's look at the, uh, the apparatus for the, uh, the decision-making process. Presidents, since much of the foreign policy decision comes from the Oval Office, have a number of ways that um, they can manage a country's foreign policy. First, of course, is to use the military. And Reagan and Bush 41 and Clinton and Bush 43 and Obama have all used the military as one of the instruments. Uh, the second would be economic, which is being used more and more. We live in an interconnected, globalized world, and it is becoming a more potent weapon, as we can see how much Iran is suffering as the economic sanctions are tightened on that country over the nuclear bomb issue. The third way is the more traditional diplomatic way. Talk, talk, talk. It's always the quietest of the tools. You use your Secretary of State, you use your ambassadors, you use State Department employees, and if you're president, you use yourself in order to push the issues on the foreign policy palette that you think are important. Now, there's two ancillary tools that can be used any number of ways. With ideological, this is a use of ideology. So if you're the United States, you're pushing democracy and you're pushing capitalism, and you want to reward your friends or what you perceive as friends, and you want to punish your enemies when they're using systems that you don't agree with. Humanitarian aid is also consistently an ancillary tool of all three. The military can really use this in the most effective way, especially when it's perceived in a poor way, and yet it's the military that arrives and provides comfort. So, for instance, the U.S. in the 2005 tsunami sent the U.S. Navy into those areas that were so enormously affected by the powerful earthquake and the tsunami. And though they were criticized, what people didn't understand was that those aircraft carriers and other ships had medical facilities on board. They provided assistance, they brought food. It wasn't always about guns and bullets. It was more about butter and bread this time. Now we see here the number of nations which have diplomatic relations with the United States, and the couple that don't. We know those in red are Cuba, Iran, Bhutan, Taiwan, and North Korea. Everyone else does, and I think the one in Europe is either Montenegro or Macedonia. I think it's Montenegro. And then, of course, the area of dispute on the northwest coast of Africa, which is kind of a territory that's managed by Morocco, but is disputed by a number of nations, including Libya and Algeria. Now, again, we mentioned earlier that the president is the chief mover and shaker when it comes to American foreign policy. He or she is aided by the diplomats in the State Department, the national security agencies like the CIA and the National Security Agency, the National Security Council within the Oval Office, and of course Congress, which has to ratify treaties, which has to pass judgment on ambassadors, and of course has to appropriate the money for the president to run American foreign policy establishment. Now, for most of our history, we've been rather isolationist. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine is kind of a statement of isolationism. Stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You know, don't come into our backyard, and we will leave your backyard alone. So, not until World War I, with the exception of some short forays into the old world, for instance, sending the U.S. Navy to roust the pirates in Tripoli I think in 1805. But for the most part, we've been isolationist. And that ends in World War I when we're involved in the Great War. And we try to return to isolationism at the end of that war, but we really can't. And perhaps that conflicted policy about what we should be, the hands-off attitude toward Europe, aided and abetted the rise of Hitler and National Socialism and Mussolini and fascism, which ultimately results in World War II. Now, after the war, we are unable to bury the hatchet with the Soviet Union, and that starts the Cold War, which lasts basically from 1946 to 1991. And this is about containment abroad, which means making sure communism doesn't expand, and about anti-communism at home. Hence, we have things like the McCarthy hearings from 1948 to 1953 at various times and in various venues. It also meant that the Pentagon, as well as the executive branch, continued to take power away from especially the legislative branch. And we also fight a number of undeclared wars, Korea, Vietnam, that make us very at some point gun shy as to what we want to do. We had been involved in a stalemate in Korea, and essentially we lose Vietnam. And so consequently, as the Cold War, we're in the middle of the Cold War in the 1960s, there's a kind of a parallel track going on. And this parallel track was what we call détente. It's started by the French and the Germans. It was a move to go from cooperation, or from confrontation to cooperation. It developed some impressive treaties. For instance, the SALT talks, SALT I and SALT II, which was an effort to limit the growth of nuclear weapons, and which it did. We originally applied détente to the Soviet Union, but we later on, especially after China opens its very closed doors in 1972, it then is also applied to China. It's not beloved by everyone. Some felt that it was a capitulation or a ratcheting down of a battle that we could have won, but this was it was an interesting time. Now, following the era of détente, that kind of ends with Jimmy Carter and the debacle over Iran in 1979, and Reagan said that we needed to restore those things that made America great. One of those things was to begin increasing the defense budget, which had been declining since the 1950s. What he did was spend $32 billion in the first 4 years of his presidency to work on things like the B-1 bomber, the B-2 bomber, the stealth fighter. And this was in opposition to what was perceived to be a Soviet buildup in arms. I think history will say that we probably overestimated the ability of the Soviets to do what we said they were doing, because their economy couldn't stand the strain of that type of buildup. We threw technology in the form of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which included Star Wars, which was supposed to block incoming Soviet missiles with the use of lasers and missiles. And after the 8 years of the Reagan administration, we saw things that we never thought we'd see before. The tearing down of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, and ultimately, the incredible happened, the end of the Soviet Union, and the breakup of the Soviet Union into separate countries, and the unification, like I said, of East and West Germany. Just when you think, though, the world is safe, then comes the war on terrorism. And that, of course, is something that is spurred on after 9/11. And both Bush and Obama have supported preemptive strikes against hostile nations, and especially terrorist groups, which don't really recognize the territorial borders of nations. And sometimes they operate like they do in Afghanistan. They sometimes operate, or they have home bases in Pakistan. So what we can say is that in this era, because of the fact that these terrorist groups don't represent nations, we've entered more of an era of improvisation, trying to figure out how do we handle these groups diplomatically? Can we handle these groups diplomatically? Now, if we look at the domestic actions of foreign policy and military policy, what political actions domestically do we take to meet national security goals? Well, since 9/11, we've created the Department of Homeland Security. That department's job is to train the military and to combat domestic and foreign terrorism. That means that it has control of things like the TSA. It influences perhaps some of the other agencies like ICE in defending borders. It is the goal of the administration is to warn foreign nations that if they harbor terrorists, they risk invasion. Iraq, Afghanistan have seen that happen. Right now, the French are in Mali, which is in North Central Africa, trying to put down an Al-Qaeda uprising there. And so most nations don't. They may unofficially sympathize with terrorism, but they don't want, especially to offend the Western world and be victims of their wrath. Now, they also, administrations, call for negotiations between warring countries so that we don't risk the destabilization of an entire region. So consequently, we've tried to minimize the upheavals in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, and we're trying to manage the transition of Syria out of the hands of the Assad family into a more democratic government. It takes time. It doesn't always pay off, as we can see with Egypt. Now, economically, we can have a little bit of effect on national security. We can freeze bank accounts of terrorist organizations and those that sympathize with them. We can mount embargoes like we have with Iran and still have with Cuba that we label terrorist-friendly. We can place nations on the most favored nation status. If they play by our rules, then they're welcome to do that. If they don't, then they're going to have a very difficult time not only trading with us, but trading with any other first world G8 nation. The ideological actions, we want to support groups or nations with similar values. So in Egypt, we're supporting, in a sense, the opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood. We're supporting the new government in Tunisia, which has talked about opposing those leftist and more radical Islamic elements. We want to provide economic support and help with their security. We recognize and support nations that support democracy in foreign nations. We declare the legitimacy or illegitimacy of a foreign country's democracy. So when Muammar Gaddafi was killed in Libya and the Revolutionary Council declared victory and that they'd like to establish a coalition government, the United States put the prestige of being the United States behind the new group. Now, military actions, of course, we've always done this. We had a little uptick in it after Operation Desert Storm in 1991. We built bases to protect friendly nations. So we built Bagram Air Force Base in Saudi Arabia. We have Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. We have a big, huge Air Force base outside Yokohama, Japan. We have bases in South Korea. We can sometimes and have blockaded the ships of enemy nations from either leaving or entering. We, along with NATO, have enforced no-fly zones. We did this over Libya, and though we have not yet done it over Syria, which denies the ability of a country to launch aircraft to fly. We've virtually destroyed much of the Libyan Air Force when they tried to defy the no-fly zone. And of course, we can also work to overthrow the government of a hostile nation. We did that with Venezuela. We were ultimately not successful, but we did work to aid the opposition in Venezuela in the early years of Chavez's presidency. Now, on the diplomatic front, we have signed a number of treaties: START, SALT. Those have been primarily between Russia and the U.S. We license or forbid the selling or possession of arms or military equipment to specific countries. On the other hand, we are selling advanced aircraft to Egypt. I guess it's ruled by whatever the need is at the time of both the United States foreign policy and the country that they're trying to aid or punish. The U.S. and the UN call upon an organization called the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IEA, to inspect countries unwilling to follow previously signed treaties. The IEA has been in Iran a number of times, and they were in Iraq before we invaded in 2003. And probably the only place they haven't been in is North Korea. Now, also, we are a member of NATO. We're the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO we formed in 1948-49, around the time of the Berlin Blockade and the establishment of the Warsaw Pact and the establishment of West Germany and East Germany. And you can see here that since the fall of communism in 1991 and the breakup of the Soviet Union, that many of the nations which were part of the Warsaw Pact have become members of NATO, which has unnerved the Russians. Though I think at some point we probably will invite the Russians to join NATO, but I think they don't want to. You'll see that Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, and Austria, along with the former republics of most of the republics of Yugoslavia, have not joined, but Greece and Turkey have, despite the fact that Greece and Turkey have a problematic relationship, to say the least. Now, we also participate in the World Trade Organizations. The GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which nations fudge on. Even we do. We try to tell other nations to not impose tariffs, but we do ourselves when it feels that a group in the United States, for instance, rubber workers who make tires, are being damaged by the fact that countries are dumping tires in the United States at prices higher or prices cheaper than it takes to produce them. So our goal, though, with the WTO and GATT is to promote free trade between nations and reducing tariffs and taxes on imported goods. Now, we also support things like the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. The IMF will go into places like Argentina and try to resurrect their economies after they have horrendous crashes. So the IMF had to work with Argentina after the 1981-83 period, and they had horrendous inflation. The IMF is helping to broker, along with the European central banks, the problems in Greece and Cyprus and other places. There's also something called the World Bank, which funds development in many countries. We have the International Red Cross through USAID. So we support a number of developing nations, probably less so when it comes to UN organizations, but we do support them there somewhat also, and we'll get to that in a minute. So here are the three. There's the IMF in the right-hand corner, the USAID in the left-hand corner, and the bottom symbol is the World Bank. Now, on the ideological front, the U.S. can recognize or not recognize the sovereignty of a new country. And many times we swiftly do it when the country becomes or turns democratic, and we're slow to do it when a country deviates and goes another way. We also use terminology like the axis of evil, the evil empire, and so on and so forth, when we don't like the actions of nations. We also use the Peace Corps or foreign aid to help prove that Americans are nice and we make it clear to nations that they may lose it, that aid, if they do not abide by what we ask them to do. We break diplomatic ties by closing an embassy in a nation that no longer supports democracy and free trade. So, for instance, we've had no diplomatic relations with Iran since 1979. We go through the Canadian embassy, or we go through the British embassy, or we now go through someone else, because I think neither of those two countries are also working in Iran. We warn U.S. citizens to not visit a nation that does not support human rights laws. We promote fair elections. Jimmy Carter certainly has been a focus on that. Less so now because he's getting old and frail, but he has through the Jimmy Carter Center in Atlanta, he has visited many countries which were facing democratic elections for the first time and helped them run decent and fair elections. We try to, when we are very disappointed with a country, we'll try to embarrass that country with a public scolding, or we use our media to broadcast directly to the country, to the country's people about what we think is taking place. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We use force to change regimes or support opposition leaders that use force, and so examples of that would be Syria, Libya, and Tunisia the past couple summers. In this case, NATO planes, or the air forces of France and Great Britain and Italy, did most of the bombing, but we used our AWACS to help guide those countries. We use a substantial amount of foreign aid in the form of military aid. So, for instance, some of that foreign aid that's going to Egypt is in the form of those F-15s that goes to the Egyptian Air Force. We use trade barriers or embargoes toward a country that doesn't ensure human rights. So, Cuba, Libya under Gaddafi, and certainly Syria and other places. We begin student exchange programs with students in a friendly country, or we sometimes boycott, like we did Moscow in 1980, and then the Russians returned the favor in 1984 when the Olympics were held in Los Angeles. And then the countries also demonstrate against us when they think we are abusing human rights. Now, when it comes to humanitarian foreign policy goals, we want to support developing nations with organizations such as the Peace Corps and the U.S. AID Agency for International Development. We help fund the World Bank. We help fund the IMF. We provide professional and military training for those countries that have new armies. We sign international treaties such as the Kyoto Protocol on global warming, though we haven't done much to support it. I'm not even sure that it will ever go into effect. We publicly scold a country for not doing more to prevent pollution. We've done that with Brazil and China, and they basically thumbed their nose at us. We support economic actions by providing access to American markets for goods from other countries. We want to provide financial support through loans and grants, because if they're selling their stuff in our country, we figure we have the right to sell our stuff in their country. There should be some quid pro quo. We can punish countries who we think have bad environmental track records by placing barriers to them selling products that are gleaned from the bad environments that they're perhaps grown in, let's say. And we know now that the actions of countries, so for instance China and its huge pollution problems, well, you know what, that smog or that pollution affects the entire globe. It certainly affects those in the northern hemisphere, and so none of us work in a void anymore. Our actions affect the actions of other countries. So we've asked, Brazil to quit destroying the Amazon basin, the rainforest, because it's barely been explored. We have tried, and are probably in better shape environmentally than we ever have been. So maybe we feel that it's right to tell other countries what to do, but other countries say we don't have that right. But we certainly can't influence them. We import oil, less so today than a decade ago, but our allies, especially in Europe, are much more vulnerable on this issue. You know, gasoline prices in Switzerland are about $9 a gallon when we make the conversion from liter to gallon. Most Americans are not willing to settle for that kind of cost factor in energy. So we have expanded domestic industry, and with shale oil and fracking, natural gas and things like that, we've been able to increase our share. Now, much of the recoverable oil, unfortunately, and much of the easily accessed oil, unfortunately, is either in the Middle East or in Russia or in Africa, so for instance, Nigeria. And increasingly, these are sites of economic and military conflict. And so we have to be ready for suddenly a country not having its product on the market because of internal disruption. Now we know that OPEC, which is the oil and petroleum exporting countries, controls the amount of oil that each member can pump, and is a cartel that establishes the price of that commodity. So we use our influence to keep, or to hope that OPEC moderates its price rises when it adjusts the price of oil per barrel. Now we can see that we have a balance of payments problem. This is in particular exacerbated by China, and what happens is we run a trade balance deficit, when imports, the stuff that we bring into the country, exceed exports, the things that we sell to other countries. And we can see that since 1998, it's been exacerbated as China has come online, and it's pretty bad. And it's been pretty much the same since '02. Now, again, we have signed on to international treaties such as the Kyoto Protocols in order to reduce global warming. I think we're doing our part. We've worked with the UN's UNICEF agency to aid refugees and the poor. We've allowed political refugees to immigrate to the U.S. So we've done our work. We have helped overthrow governments that abuse human rights using military force. Now, when it comes to the types of philosophies that are out there, the term isolationist is the one that's used most often in a negative way. Few people share its beliefs, who share its beliefs, use it to describe their own foreign policy perspective. They believe in America first. They believe that national sovereignty trumps international relations. Unionists, libertarians, anti-globalization protesters usually find ourselves in this area. And when we look at isolationists, they are wary of these kind of things. They don't want the U.S. to be involved in the UN. They don't want us getting involved in different alliances or signing different agreements. They believe the U.S. should keep its troops home. They shouldn't act as a global cop. They support trade practices that should include the use of tariffs to protect American workers. They oppose liberal immigration problems. They oppose American imperialism. They desire to preserve what they see as America's character, national identity, and its traditions. An historical isolationist would be Calvin Coolidge. A modern isolationist would be, I think, writer, commentator, presidential candidate Patrick Buchanan. Now, when it comes to liberals, foreign policy school liberals believe that Americans are hypocritical and arrogant. But of course, that's in the eye of the beholder. They think that America is hated because of our past foreign policy programs. They believe that political solutions should always trump military solutions. They believe that the U.S. is morally bound to intervene in humanitarian crises. They oppose American imperialism. They support international law and alliances and agreements. They probably believe in, one world government. They like the fact that the U.S. is involved in the UN. They believe that U.S. economic policies must help lift up the poor. And if we look at to foreign policy school liberals, Woodrow Wilson historically, Jimmy Carter more recently. With the foreign policy neoconservatives, also known as neocons, they think the United States should have a policy that makes them an unchallenged superpower. They share an unwavering support of Israel, and they support the fact that Americans, if they see something wrong, should ignore maybe the caution flag from their allies and engage in unilateral action. They support preemptive strikes to remove perceived threats to the U.S. To U.S. security. Right now, President Obama uses drones. They believe that you need to promote the development of an American empire. They equate American power with the potential for world peace. Again, that previous one, promote the development of an American empire. Again, that's in the eye of the beholder. Americans can sometimes be called imperialistic, but we have very little in the way to show traditionally what imperialists do, which is gain control of other countries and make them colonies. We really haven't done a lot of that. Now, liberals, of course, seek to democratize the Arab world. We want to push regime change in states deemed threats to the U.S. or its allies. You know what? I think I forgot to change this thing here. This should actually say FPS neocons, right? Yeah, it should. So at the top there, it should say foreign policy neocons. And we see that a historical neoconservative would be Teddy Roosevelt, and a modern neoconservative would be Secretary of State Colin Powell. Now, foreign policy schools of thought, the realist. These are guided by people who take every situation and look at it from that situation's uniqueness. It doesn't approach it from an ideological vision, like with neocons or liberals or isolationists. It believes that U.S. power is crucial to successful diplomacy and vice versa. It doesn't want U.S. policy options unduly limited by world opinion or ethical considerations. That doesn't mean that it can always move or use their power unilaterally, but it has to be sensitive to what the world thinks at the same time. We believe that strong alliances are important to U.S. interest, NATO, SEATO, things like that. We need to weigh the political costs of foreign action. We probably did in 2003 with Iraq. We believe that foreign intervention must be dictated by a compelling national interest. Hence, the reason that we're in Afghanistan. And again, this is realist, not liberals. I forgot to change it. An historical realist would be President Dwight D. Eisenhower. A modern realist would be the ever-evolving Secretary of State, Colin Powell. Now let's look at our defense spending. Currently, it takes a little bit less than 1/5 of the federal budget. It will be going down with sequestration and the fact that we're winding down our roles in Afghanistan and Iraq. Conservatives argue that budget cuts would leave the military unprepared. Liberals argue that budget cuts for the military have to occur in order to spend more money on domestic programs, despite the fact that much of that spending doesn't probably work very well. Military spending is hard to cut because it means there will be job losses in districts that have companies that receive defense budget funding. So congressmen and congresswomen and senators are loath many times to vote for ending programs that would have a detrimental effect on their districts. We can see here that that since the 1950s, defense spending, with a bump in the 1980s under the Reagan rearmament, has continued to go down and down and down to where it's now about 17% of the budget, compared to, 53% of the budget prior to the Kennedy-Nixon election in 1960. That's unimaginable. But back then, remember, we didn't have the baby boomers yet. We were still a relatively young nation with lots of kids and very few retirees receiving Social Security. Now the shoe is on the other foot. We have about 1.4 million active troops and reserve troops. Especially since 2002, we've had much more of a reliance on the National Guard and on reserve troops who have done tours of Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. We rely on a nuclear triad, intercontinental ballistic missiles, surface, land-based missiles, strategic bombers. All those are expensive to uh, to uh, to carry as military. We have reduced the number of nuclear weapons that we have, as have the Russians using the START program. High tech is becoming much more important than nuclear weapons. But note that this is also an area that is high cost. We have had to start and stop airplane programs because the money being spent on the planes ultimately at the time just didn't seem like we were getting enough bang for the buck, considering the planes were being sold for 9 figures. And we can see that the Navy and the Army and the Air Force are relatively equal in size, with the Army being a little bit larger. All three, though, will go down as we reduce the size of our armed forces. Now, the military power, if we look at the big picture, is losing much of its utility in resolving many international issues. I think that's kind of driven by the fact that we're not fighting nations, we are fighting terrorist groups. And sometimes the military isn't all that effective. You can't fight an enemy that you can't find. So we have turned more to using economic sanctions, um, using non-military penalties, um, but ultimately many people think that these economic sanctions, embargoes, and things like that only hurt U.S. businesses and provoke a nationalist backlash in the nation that we are trying to change. It makes them, even though people should be thinking rationally, many of them don't when they feel that their country is being threatened by the United States. That happened in Venezuela. It's happened in other places. Only a few nations have known nuclear weapons capabilities. We're pretty sure the Israelis have a bomb or two. Iran's trying to get one. We're pretty sure that North Korea has one or two. And of course, the Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Indians. It's been reputed that maybe South Africa has one, but I'm not sure we take that seriously. Great Britain, France have nuclear weapons, and of course, the United States. And the big fear as we move into this new era of improvisational diplomacy and things like that is that a rogue nation, somebody like Iran, somebody like North Korea, will use nuclear weapons on their neighbors, like North Korea in the last month has been threatening to do on South Korea and now the United States. Now we can see the spread of nuclear weapons. We can see the nations that have it. So we can see the purple nations: China, India, Pakistan, France. I guess I did name them all. We can see the nations that have given up nuclear weapons. We can see the nations that are seeking nuclear weapons, but now we can take Libya off that map.